Okay, today we're going to go over the double exposure technique, and this is going to build off of the last lesson with ways to crop out photos and particularly using masks. So if you're unfamiliar with cropping out photos and particularly using detailed masks for your crops, I would recommend going to the previous tutorial and just checking that out here. And those techniques will become important here. So the double exposure technique, you can see I Googled it right here. And we have some examples of this technique here. So you can just kind of see, this is kind of where we're going here. On the D2L, you can find your own pictures here. But if you want to use some of the pictures that I'm using on the D2L under demo pictures, I have some of the images I'm working with here downloaded onto my computer. And so to start off, I have this image right here, and I'm just gonna start fresh with it. So I just have this side profile image here, and you can kind of see with these double exposure examples right here, you know, there's typically, you don't have to use a person, right? That's just kind of the typical thing here. A lot of people use animals. It can be anything, right? But you know, I'm gonna start with a person and then crop them out here, and it's going to be important that I use a mask once I make the crop. And so the last lesson, I showed a lot of different techniques we could use for cropping this person out, and we could use basically any of them here, except for the pen tool technique, since she has this kind of hair right here. So I am going to just duplicate my background layer, and I'm going to create a new empty layer and just fill it. So I have a green screen. That'll just help me create a good crop here. So I'll call this the fill for my green screen, and then I'll call this person. And for this layer right here, I'm going to start with the object selection tool, which is right here. And with the object selection tool, you just drag out an area, and Photoshop kind of figure out a selection right there. And it makes a very crude selection. So this is not going to be the crop we do by any stretch of the imagination here. And again, I go over this technique in great detail on the last lesson here. And it's important that you go up to select and mask, and our interface is going to change to kind of a customized cropping interface. So I'll click select mask. Remember, I created the green screen before, so which is underneath this. And so we have our properties tab over here, and then we have a new tools tab over here to the left. And the main slider right here that I use is the transparency slider. So if I move this to 100%, you can see this is the crop that the object selection tool made right there, which is very crude, not a great crop, right? And then if I move the transparency to 0, we can see the original image, and you can put it somewhere in between as you kind of try to sort through this. So there's two brushes that I use here, these two. And so our first brush is the quick selection brush, which helps us just kind of select areas that we want to keep. And we're not going to use that one so much right now because the object selection tool kind of did a lot of that. But I'm going to do the refine edge brush tool, which I usually call the refine hair brush tool. So if you hear me select the refine hair brush, I'm referring to this brush right here. So I'll click on that, and it helps me, I kind of keep, remember you can use the bracket tool, the square brackets tool, to make the brush smaller or bigger right there. And I'm just going to subtract out some of these areas. It's pretty smart. Like as long as you keep the brush pretty small, it'll kind of, especially with a character or a person who's in front of a white cyc or background like this one, is it'll kind of subtract out the areas of the hair. You know, there's some areas that were selected white right there. And if I get the brackets a little bigger, maybe it'll kind of start to bring back some of this hair that's showing up here. Working with these tools is a little funky sometimes, but you can see it's kind of bringing back some of that hair right there, subtracting out some of the hair. So this brush, typically it's important for you to kind of use the bracket tools and get it to the right size so that it's not having to compute too much all at once. And it can usually, if you keep the brackets relatively small and are just patient and kind of keep brushing in the areas that you want, it is pretty good at sorting everything out for you here. So pretty helpful brush, and it's not going to get it perfect, but it's going to give us a pretty darn good starting point on this whole thing. So I have some frizz up front, which I'd like to bring back. And just using that technique to get the crop. And so one reason I put in that green screen before is the green screen, what I love about using green screens is it just presents your crop in the least flattering light possible. And so it just helps you kind of create, like, hopefully a high quality crop here. So I'm not going to spend too much time obsessing over this because this lesson really isn't about cropping, right? It's important to know how to do it, but I'm trying to show the double exposure technique. So I just pressed OK, which was at the bottom right over here, to get to this point. So sorry I skipped ahead without saying what I was doing. Just in that window, just look for the bottom right and press OK once you have the selection where you want it. And you can tell, so we have a selection going right now. You can tell because we have the zebra dotted line right here, which is Photoshop's indication that we've made a selection. And we want to press this button right here, which is the rectangle with the circle inside it, and that is the Add Layer Mask button right there. And so it's going to add a mask onto this layer right here. And it's going to be a great way to create a crop on this character. And it'll create the crop non-destructively, meaning we won't actually delete any of this image. So we'll have it available to us if we need it at any point. So I'll just click this button with that layer selected, and it kind of made that crop. We have it, so we have a mask here, and then the layer here. So be careful where the brackets show up on your layer, because right now the mask is selected, and right now the layer is selected. So something important to keep in mind right there. So I'll go ahead and hide my green screen. And zoom in and make sure this crop's okay. If you want to make any adjustments to your crop, so I am leaving the green screen on just for a moment, is if I want to adjust my crop, I can make my colors black and white here. And with any mask, and I go over this a lot in the last lesson, is the white areas are the areas of the mask where we're keeping the image, black areas are areas where we're subtracting. So on this mask that's connected to the person right there, I'm going to switch to my white brush, go to the brush tool, and you can see here there's some area of translucency under her nose. So with the white brush I can just paint it in right there on my mask, and it'll bring it back. So any area that you can kind of paint, you can bring it back. You can see some area of translucency, which I don't love right here. Right, so you can just kind of customize, fine-tune your crop, and just get it improved by using the black and white brushes in Photoshop onto the mask, right? And so you can really get in there and customize this thing and get this thing perfect. So now we're kind of moving into the double exposure technique. And so I'm going to start with the basics of the double exposure technique, and then we'll kind of move on from there. So first off, I use this fill layer just to help me kind of get a good crop. But now we're kind of moving on to the next step. So I'm going to create a new fill, and I'll call this white fill. And I'm just going to fill the background. It's an empty layer right now, and just give it a white background right there. So we have a blank slate to work off of. And I'm going to open some kind of landscape photo that I want to superimpose on top of this using the double exposure technique. So I'm going to go down to downloads off of those images I downloaded. Let's look at some of these. That could be a good one. That one's okay. Yeah, those look okay. So I'm going to open these two in Photoshop. So I have two landscape photos right there. And let's start with this one. So I'm just going to bring this over into my image. So remember, we can right click on, go to duplicate layer. This tab will come up. Under the document tab, just bring it over to our original image and press OK. So now I have that image kind of imported into this image I've been working off of right now. So the first thing I want to do is I want to think about placement for this. So I'm just going to take the opacity down to 50% and just kind of visualize how I want this to be superimposed onto the rest of my image here, or onto my person that I have positioned here. So let's try that. I don't know, we'll see. And I'll get the opacity back up. I'll call this lake. Let's call it lake 1, just in case I make another. And so here, this is where the mask comes in, and this is like the most important part of this technique, is that we've made this initial crop of the person with a mask that exists right there, and I want to take that mask right there and apply it to this lake layer right here. So let me see here. What am I doing? Sorry. I had a brain fart. So I want to take this mask right here and apply it to the lake. And so the best way to do that is just solo this layer right here, go down to channels, and you can see here it made a mask before. So this is under my channels. And you can see here, this is the mask I created. So if you remember back to the last lesson, right, white is the area that is going to stay, black are the areas that are going to get cropped out whenever you're creating a mask. And so I want to take this mask, put it onto the lake. So here's how you do that. It's already the right colors. If this was inversed, we would need to go to image adjustments and invert it. And by that I mean if she was black and the background was white, we would need to inverse it. So I would need to go to image adjustments and invert, but this is good right here. And this is the button that down here that creates a selection of the white area. So we're going to select that, and you can see that the Photoshop's dotted line is kind of going around it, so we now have a selection. Now I'm going to hide that mask and bring back on the visibility of my other channel layers. This should all be familiar to you if you watched the last lesson. Go over to layers and click on my lake layer right there. And then to apply that selection and turn that into a mask that gets applied to lake 1 right there, I just need to press this button right here, the rectangle with a circle inside of it, add layer mask, and that'll apply, you see, the mask of the person onto that image right there. Add my white fill back in the background right there. And this is the fundamental component of the double exposure technique. This is the main kind of idea you need to get. So if any of this seems kind of unfamiliar, I would just suggest you kind of rewind and kind of make sure you kind of get this lesson up to this point here. One other super important thing here before I kind of keep rolling with this is the way that this works is we have the layer right here. We have the mask right here. So if I paint black or white on the mask, it'll kind of expand out some of the shape of this mask right here. And if I paint here, it'll kind of paint onto the layer itself. So you see I have a white brush and it's painting onto the layer. And if I select the mask and I paint white, it's going to extend out the mask itself. And we have this little chain link right here, which means they're both linked. So now that since they're both linked, if I press Command T or go up to Edit and then Free Transform and move this layer around, you can see it all kind of stays together right there. Press that and undo. And if I do the turn it off, and now I select the layer, so you have to make sure that the layer is selected, not the mask, but the layer, and I press Command T, you can see I can reposition the image, but keep the mask in place. So this is super important in terms of kind of rediscovering your placement, figuring out how you want this thing to look, and kind of finding your shapes right there. Once you've found the position, I like to just go up to this check mark right here to accept it and press OK. And remember, you can kind of turn that lake back on. For this specific technique, if we have the chain link off, moving the mask isn't really helpful, right? Because we want the mask to be the same on all of our different layers. So you don't really ever want to move this around while using this technique. But sometimes you might want to turn that chain link off and reposition the layer right there and get that repositioned. So I'll turn the chain link back on. And so this is the main fundamental of the double exposure technique. So from here, here's where we start to explore how we can kind of make this our own and make adjustments here. Depending on the images that you're using right now, up until this point, you should have been doing the exact same thing as I've been doing pretty much. But after you get to this point, this is the area where we might split off a little bit, depending on what you want this to look like, what kind of color treatment you want it to have, stuff like that. You know, so now we're moving into the realm of kind of customization here. So first off, I have my lake, and we have these different overlay modes right here. And you can see as I kind of scroll through them, we can see what some of these different overlays look like here. And they're all looking a little wonky right now, which is okay. So typically when you see a double exposure technique, there is a lot of desaturation happening on these. And I think it's really important when using this technique, or when you're going for double exposure, is to use adjustment layers while you're making color corrections, because adjustment layers are non-destructive ways of changing the brightness, contrast, the levels, the colors, stuff like that. It's a non-destructive way of doing that. So if you try something, you don't like it, you can always just turn that layer off and keep moving. Whereas if I were to kind of apply desaturation to the person directly by going image adjustments, and let's do hue saturation, take the saturation down right there, I'm stuck with it. Right, like it's locked in, I've worked destructively, the color is now gone from the image, I can't bring it back. So what I would rather do is, rather than going to image adjustments and doing my color corrections here, is I would rather go down here to the Ghostbusters button underneath the layer menu, and here I can go do hue saturation. And here, the way adjustment layer works, so we have our adjustment layer right here, I can desaturate it, so the same thing, and it'll desaturate any image that is underneath the adjustment layer. So you can see here I have my lake picture and it's on top. It's not desaturated because it's over it. One cool technique here with these adjustment layers is, let me just bring this back to 0. Is if you there's two ways you can do this, and it kind of depends on what kind of adjustment layer you're doing. But let's say that I want to turn her green or yellow, green. Here we go, and I want it to only affect the layer that's underneath it, and I don't want it to affect all these other layers. So I'll kind of turn the lake back on and move it underneath. And so if I want this adjustment layer to only affect the person, but not the lake, I can just press this button right here. And it kind of adds what's called a clipping mask to it. So I click that button right there, and that arrow will show up right to the left of it. And so now that color correction, you can see is turning her green, will only be affecting the layer that's directly beneath the adjustment layer right there. So it's only going to be the person right now. If I hide the person, you can see it's not affecting the lake anymore, or it's not affecting the lake at all, because I created that quote-unquote clipping mask right there. So I can turn that off at any point by clicking right here, and I have to double click to kind of bring back up my hue saturation adjustment layer. And I'm going to turn that off, and now the lakes should change colors here. You see that? So I turned it off. And so now the adjustment layer is affecting all the layers that are underneath it. And if you press this button right here, it'll only affect the layer that's directly underneath it. Some adjustment layers don't have this button on it. And so if that's the case, you can do the same thing by right-clicking and going down and finding Create Clipping Mask right here. So on the adjustment layer, right-click, go down to Create Clipping Mask, and so now it kind of does that same thing, right? That's the clipping mask button. And so now you see the color is not affecting the lake, but it is affecting the person right there. So you can always just right click on an adjustment layer and go down to create clipping mask, or you can release the clipping mask to bring it back to normal. And you can tell a clipping mask is on a layer if there's an arrow right there. So let me bring the lake back on top here, if it'll let me do it. There we go. And I'm going to bring this back to 0 right there, and I want to desaturate this thing. I want to kind of bring this back to a desaturated image, and this will make these different overlay modes look a little bit better here. So this is actually pretty simple, right? I just have the person, I have her cropped out with a mask, I have the lake, I have her cropped out using that same mask that I used to create the person right there, and you can tell the mask is on by this icon right there. And then I have a hue saturation adjustment layer that's on top of the person but underneath the lake, just desaturating the person here. And so now with the lake selected, I'm going to select the lake, go down here, and I'm going to try some different overlay modes, and I'm going to see if I can find something that looks kind of cool. And still struggling a little bit on this one. Let's see what we can find here. That one's starting to look like something there. And we might need to desaturate this one as well. I was starting to begin to have some luck with the screen mode, right? It just kind of depends on your taste. So let's try the screen mode. And I'm going to delink them. Press Command T, and I'm just going to make another adjustment to that. See what this looks like where it's a little bit bigger. Okay, so delinking your masks to your layer is really important when using this technique, right? Because you're always just going to be messing around with repositioning, trying some different ideas, getting this thing looking better here. So this is kind of the heart of the double exposure technique. It really helps to kind of work with more desaturated palettes here, and we'll kind of begin to work with adjustment layers to kind of bring out the best of this thing. So here I can keep adding adjustment layers and messing around with it, and so I think that's kind of what I'm inclined to do here. So for the lake, I might relink it, and I'll experiment with some more adjustment layers on this thing. So there's going to be the rest of this is we're going to be taking these lessons that I've shown here and then using adjustment layers to continue to fine tune this concept here. You can see we also have a hard edge down here, and I'd like to get rid of that, so that's something else I need to consider. I have this image right here. Why don't we do the same thing? So we'll take this tree, I'm going to flip it upside down, try it down here, see if I can position it in a way that looks good. Another thing I could have done is I could crop the whole image and end up with something composed like this. You know, that looks pretty good. You know what? For brevity, let's do that. So I'm going to press C, and I'm going to come in, and I'm going to crop the image like this because I think that's starting to kind of look, I'm kind of feeling that out. So I'll just press C for the crop, reposition it, press OK. So we have the image cropped like this. And let's continue to work with the concept here. So I have the lake. I have an adjustment layer desaturating the person underneath right there. And then I have the person cropped out and then a white background underneath. So here with the lake, I might experiment with more adjustment layers. So I might try, so to try an adjustment layer on the lake, I'm going to the Ghostbusters button for the adjustment layers. I'm going to go to levels, and I'm going to click the clipping mask button right here so that it's only affecting the lake. And I'm going to start giving it a little more contrast so that it kind of pokes out a little bit more. And so here's something that's really interesting. So with level controls, we have, if you bring this slider in, that's our dark tones, and so that's going to make the darks darker. Same thing here, we're going to make the whites whiter. And then here we have our midtones, and so if we take the midtones right here and drag it to the left, the midtones will get brighter. Then if you bring it to the right, the midtones will get darker. And you can see in my navigator view, even though this is getting obscured a little bit, I kind of like the way this looks when my midtones get a little bit darker on this. And so yeah, so just did a levels control on this thing. Levels adjustment layer, and you can see that I have a clipping mask on it, so it's only affecting my lake image right there. And I kind of like the colors that are going on here. but we have like a pretty nice start to this thing. One thing to keep in mind here is I kind of like some of the shapes that are being made here, but let's say for a second that you can see the lake is projecting onto her chin, but also onto her hair right there. So let's just say for a minute we don't want it to project onto the hair. This is where masks become helpful. So I have my lake image right here, right? We have the lake image, then we have the the mask right there. And so the mask, remember, if we paint black on the mask, it'll subtract, and if we paint white on the mask, it'll add to the mask, because the mask is a black and white image. We'll go to the black, press B for the brush, paint in here to get the lake to not project onto her hair. So this is a great example of mask giving you kind of added flexibility with your images right there. You know, so just hypothetically, if I wanted that to happen, I could do that. I'm not really convinced that's what I would actually do, but I just kind of want to show that that's something that can be done there. For the person, sometimes with these masks, I like to just experiment with what this begins to look like if you kind of subtract areas right here. So you can see here that I can start to kind of figure out what does this look like. So I'm just painting black onto the person's mask right here. And I'm just kind of concepting it. This is kind of rough work that I'm doing right here because I'm just trying to figure out what would this look like if part of her head was kept, you know, and the mountain was there, and then we have the tree line happening there. So you can kind of start to experiment with masks to do this technique. In order to do this technique entirely properly, instead of painting onto it, I could do this, or I just paint onto the person's mask and get that figured out. Or I can use one of the more complicated cropping techniques. Let me edit undo to kind of bring that back. Or I can do one of the more complicated masking techniques onto the lake itself to create a crop, create a mask on the lake right there around that tree line. So if I were to do that, and again, I'm kind of getting into experimentation here, right? That's kind of a big part of this, is I kind of brought you all up to that initial point, but after that, we kind of get into experimentation here. But if I wanted to create that crop, I would just do that same technique for the cropping that I showed on the person, right? But just on the lake image itself to kind of crop out that area right there if I wanted to crop out the tree line, something like that. And so, again, I kind of like the way this is going, so I'm sure that I want to do that. So there's kind of some decisions you can make on that. Let me just see here. I can also use a light brush to kind of feather that out a little bit at the top up there. So that's something else you could do, because that hairline was getting a little distracting with some of that frizz, you know, so you could do something like that up here. There's just, as long as you got like a command of how these layers are working with each other, and the more you experiment with it, the more it'll become really second nature, the better this technique will go for you here. And it really is just understanding crops, having masks for those crops, and then using some adjustment layers on the whole thing here. So here's something really helpful that I want to show you, is with adjustment layers, I can group all these and create an adjustment layer that kind of goes over everything here. So I have my white fill, which is on its own layer right here. And let's say I want to take the person in the lake and all of its accompanying layers and group it, is I can just hold Shift, select them all. You can press Command G, or this folder button right here. And I'll call this double exposure. And so everything's on a layer right there, except for the white background. And so here I can kind of continue to make adjustment layers and have it affect only the white background, or affect what we have, the imagery we have here. So here I can do a new adjustment layer. And here's one that I really like a lot. It's called Color Lookup. And this is if you want to kind of unify your palette. So you can do adjustment layer, color lookup. And this window should show up. And so we have like these different kind of looks that we can apply to it. So we can see here we have what's called the two strip look. Let me see if I can reposition this in a way that's not covering everything up. I guess not. So I have the two strip look, the three strip look. We can try like a few different kind of color combos here. And you get some really nice desaturated one here. So we have like futuristic bleak here. You know, a lot of these double exposure techniques tend to look a little more elegant if they're not even totally black and white, but just kind of low saturation color. They can look great with high color saturation too. It's just low saturation is something I tend to see a lot of with this technique. And the reason for that is it generally works here. So we have a late sunset. That looks pretty cool. Let me just try a few of these other ones and see which one I want to go with here. Here we go. All right, so this is one I feel pretty good about. So we have teal orange plus contrast as a 3D color lookup adjustment layer here. So turn it off, right? So that's what we originally had. Turn it on. That's what it looks like now. You know, just kind of depends on your taste, which one you like more. With the adjustment layer here, you can take the opacity slider and you can blend it. So if I at 100%, this is with the color lookup adjustment layer all the way on there. I can take the opacity of it, bring it all the way to 0, and it's back to where it was. And you can kind of experiment with finding like an in-between here. So maybe I do just a 50-50 of the two, end up with something like that. And so another great thing about adjustment layers is you can blend them in with your original image and kind of really start to come up with something here. So color lookup, a really helpful way to kind of unify the palette of your images, especially as you're using double exposure to bring in separate images together into the same composition. Something else that I like a lot is the gradient, which is, so sorry, let me explain that more before I do it. So the adjustment layer gradient. So I'll just click on that and go up to gradient right here. And you can see right off the bat, it looks like that, which is a little bit much. So one thing that's cool here is, remember, I have my white background, then I have my double exposure over here. So I can take my gradient and then kind of put it below. I need to make some adjustments to the gradient. I can bring it on top and have it double click it. Oh yeah, this is one where I have to right click and go down to clipping mask and have it only adjust the character themselves. But again, this gradient isn't, I need to make adjustments to this gradient. So to make adjustments to the gradient, we can double click it and it looks like this. The angle is just going straight up and down right now, which is what I want right now. And so to kind of make further adjustments to it, I just need to click here and get to the gradient editor. And here, right now, the gradient is going from, it's not doing a good gradient here. So let's do black to white. And so right now I need to inverse these. And so the way I typically do that is, I guess I could just go to that one, right? So that's the easiest way to invert it, but I want to kind of show you this technique, is we can kind of customize the gradient by clicking on these little markers right here, and you can add your own by just clicking right there, and you can add your own gradients right here. So I can click right here, the color's black. I can click on the color and make it like purple or something like that. If I want to change this one to yellow, I just click right there, change the color. And if I wanted to go from blue to green to yellow, I can just click right here, click on that color, click on that color right there, go up here and go to green. So you can really get your own customized gradients down here. Additionally, I'm just going to go back to the black and white. We have, it's hard to see, but down here we have a bunch of preset ones. So we can try like a blue. There's a lot of things we can kind of try here in regard to the gradients. I know I wanted to go kind of from light to dark down here, I think. So I can just kind of look through these, see which ones that I like the most. That one's starting to look pretty good. So you can also, if you want to switch them, you see what I'm doing here. So it started like this. And so I can just click on the arrow that's above that one, drag it to the left, drag this one to the right. Got to be really careful how you drag it though. You see it kind of disappearing on me a little bit there. Okay, so I can inverse them and press OK. And so, you know, we have a gradient that's just going on top of everything, you know, not exactly what I want. But I can put it underneath the character, the person themselves. If I want it to go like that, I'll press Edit Undo to keep it on top. I can right click and go to create clipping mask. And so now it's only going to go on top of this group right here where I have all my double exposure stuff. And from here, I can go to different overlay modes and just see if something, you know, this is all about experimentation here, largely here. So you can see right here, I did like hard light looks okay to me. So this is it originally. This is it with the gradient on. So it kind of creates like a unifying factor to this. And remember, and it's not affecting my, my background at all. And I can also go down here to the opacity, take the opacity down and just, you know, I can have it at 100% or bring it down to something subtler at 0, you know, down to 0. So for here, I might like this to be somewhere around 80% right there. And with using the gradient and the color lookup, I've kind of created some elements here that help unify the image and just kind of create like a nice glue to the overall thing here. So I'm going to turn off the visibility of those. So, I mean, that looks pretty good on its own, right? It just depends what you're looking for. But just remember, you can keep messing with adjustment layers. So I'm turning them back on there just to kind of experiment with different looks here. And so I was showing the color lookup, the gradient fill adjustment layers. There was also additionally, like I used a levels and a hue saturation adjustment layer in there. And you can kind of keep messing with this too. Like I could even, I think I'll need this, but we can try it, where I'll make a new adjustment layer on the top. We could try a photo filter, which is a lot like the color lookup. And here, this is called a warming filter, which is what it starts with at top. It starts at a 25% density, which is a lot like opacity. I can drag that up, and you can see what it looks like over the whole thing right there. So just another technique you can use for glue. Different filters. So we have warming filter 1 and 2. So warming filter 1, warming filter 2, those look exactly the same to me, but you can see warming filter 3 looks a little different. We have some cooling filters and we can kind of experiment with some of those and see what works. Bring the intensity back down. And so just finding different combinations of these and kind of dialing in exactly what you want. You can get really specific with your image and end up with exactly what you're shooting for here. So this has been the double exposure technique.